Welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It's now 9:10 p.m. in an extremely cold Budapest, where again the spring weather is some way off. It doesn't seem to be making its appearance as it sometimes promised to do. So yeah, it's quite unpleasantly, unseasonably cold. However, on a more cheerful note, thank you everybody who has joined me. This is our Tuesday night for me live stream, and there's obviously quite a lot going on. And one thing, obviously, that's rather interesting, and we're going to talk about the tariffs and the economic, economic conflicts that Trump has started. Is that there's now quite an interesting spat taking place between Peter Navarro, who is the President Trump's special advisor on trade and tariffs, and Elon Musk. So you remember they already got into it, or at least Navarro, rather Musk got into it on the issue of the H-1B visas, which came up. I was thinking last December, and Navarro. No, it was more like Bannon. I always think of Bannon and Navarro as being together because they both co-host the Bannon show War Room, and of course they both went to prison for 4 months for contempt of Congress, and so on the H-1B visas. If you recall, Musk expressed considerable goodwill towards them. He said, "Yeah, they're a great idea," and of course that triggered Bannon and said, "Well, this is certainly not compatible with MAGA and any attempt to use foreigners, foreign labor, to replace the labor of Americans." So that was last December, and Musk backed away from that fight, and so said, "Yeah, well, I'm for it, but we need to reform it, blah blah blah." But basically, he backed away. He didn't want to get into a real banging of heads with Steve Bannon. But now, Musk is not exactly very happy with the tariff policy. He's been relatively quiet about it, and then the other day he responded to the tariff policy by saying that anyone who has a sort of a PhD in economics from Harvard probably doesn't know anything about economics. Everyone knew that right away, that he was referring to Peter Navarro, and so it went on, and then Navarro was on CNBC's Squawk Box the other day, and the issue of that Musk tweet with the about the PhD in economics from Harvard, what he thought about that, and then Navarro responded by saying, "Well, it's understandable. I mean, Musk is he's not really a car manufacturer; he's a car assembler, and so therefore he requires parts from all parts of the world. So they're not American-made parts that he uses to assemble cars. They are parts from everywhere." and that is in fact correct. I mean, he gets parts from China, he gets parts from Taiwan, he gets parts from Vietnam, he gets parts from Germany. He does indeed get parts, and so Navarro said, I want American manufacturers in which all the parts of any American manufactured product, all of the parts are made in the USA. Now that comment about that Musk is not a car manufacturer, Musk is a car assembler, really upset Musk, and he sent out a tweet calling Peter Navarro a moron. And and then that, as if that wasn't enough, then he actually referred to him as Peter Retardo. Now that's really painful because, of course, the word retard has been banned. I mean, it's regarded as prohibited because it's so horrific. Because it's anyone who's intellectually or educationally challenged cannot be called a retard. So it used to be a way you used to refer to them, at school. I mean, it's more of an American thing, not a British thing. So we didn't really call people retards at school. We did call them spastics, and I have to say I still retain that terminology, and sometimes refer to somebody as a spastic, even though that's clearly unacceptable. But retard is something that you do at school, and then of course it's you realize in later life that it's prohibited. So that's the question with Navarro. I don't know what's going to happen here, because you really can't have members of an administration calling one another morons and retards. I mean, it's just it doesn't look good. I mean, I guess Trump is a little unusual in that he, after all, he himself, at least during his first term, he hasn't done it during his second term, but during his first term, he would attack members of his own administration via tweets, particularly Jeff Sessions. And then he finally did sack Jeff Sessions. But I do wonder, though, because about Musk, because it doesn't look like Musk is entirely on board with the with the tariff policy. I mean, it's just because it is contrary to his own interests. Now, on the tariffs, the big sort of Black Monday that the media were eagerly touting throughout the weekend. They just couldn't they waited with bated breath when the Asian markets would open on Monday morning, and of course that's late afternoon in on the east coast of the United States. They waited with bated breath, but of course the big Black Monday never materialized. I mean, it was a little bit of a tumble, but not so much. And then, of course, today the stock markets have picked up, and they picked up in Europe, they picked up in Asia, they picked up in the United States. So the panic is over, and which the media were playing very, very energetically, in the hope that they will provoke a truly historic collapse on the stock exchanges, and that would force Trump into a humiliating withdrawal. I mean, that was the strategy. They were waiting for a humiliating retreat from Trump, and then from that moment on, it would be very unlikely that Trump's presidency could recover, because this is clearly his signature issue. This is his big thing. He's been talking about it for decades. He was talking about it a great deal during the years in exile, during the 4 years, the Biden years in exile, and then of course it was an important plank of his election campaign, he would introduce tariffs. And everyone eagerly repeated that if the market continues to fall, and Trump being the transactional politician that he is, Trump will be forced to retreat, and that Trump could not, and Trump being a winner, somebody who's, he wants to be a winner. Trump cannot preside over a tumbling stock market. So he would be forced to make a retreat, and that would be a humiliation. That would be the beginning of the end of the Trump presidency. Well, it never materialized. And today the market did very well, recovered quite a lot of the losses. But then, of course, later in the day, it started tumbling again because of the Trump's promise of essentially would be 104% tariffs on China, and this is quite interesting because everybody else, I mean, as Trump and Scott Besson pointed out, that Japan, South Korea, the Europeans, they've all got in with the program, which is you have to go negotiate with Trump. Don't start retaliating yet. You have to go negotiate with Trump. And Trump has been very boastful. He's saying, yeah, I had a great conversation with the Japanese prime minister. We're going to have negotiations with Japanese. And then he said that he sent out the truth about South Koreans. Yeah, we got to get a good talk with the South Koreans. We're going to talk to them. And the Europeans are also talking in terms of, well, we got to, let's see if we can reduce it to kind of 0-0 tariffs. Now, obviously, there's a problem here, and that was spelled out by Peter Navarro, who's really the driving force behind this. Peter Navarro, who said that 0-0 that doesn't cut it, because even if you reduce the tariff to 0, you've got all the non-tariff barriers that will remain. And Navarro has listed the non-tariff barriers. He said, well, you've got the VAT tax, that's of 19% in Europe, and you have all the various regulations. They can put any kind of safety and regulations in place to guarantee that American products will be kept out of out of markets. So and he said this about particularly the Europeans and of course then the Vietnamese. So he's saying no, that's won't be acceptable 0-0. We actually have to address the non-tariff barriers. Now that's Navarro talking, and I assume he's speaking for Trump, because I don't think Trump would simply go for 0-0. I think he would. This is something he has always talked about, and rightly, which is the non-tariff trade barriers, and that how you can always keep products out, and you can just cheat in your trading relation. You can subsidize exports. You can subsidize industries. You can use third parties to avoid tariffs. So in other words, this is the accusation against the Vietnamese that the Chinese use the Vietnamese to sell their products to the United States, and thereby avoiding the tariffs that have been imposed upon China. But nonetheless, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the Europeans have all said that we are ready to talk to the Trump administration. But China didn't. China retaliated and said, we're going to hit back with a 34% tariff. And that really just set Trump off. And so now, essentially, all Chinese products it's got a 104% tariff. Now, my view is that this is the Chinese are making a huge mistake, that they cannot win a trade war with the United States. They simply can't do it. The U.S. economy is not only much bigger and much stronger than the Chinese economy, but basically, if you're an exporter, if you're an export-driven economy, you are dependent upon markets being open to you. Because if markets are close to you, and for the Chinese, that's their big market. It's the U.S. market that's your big market, as it is for the Europeans in a sense. Also, that's the big market. That's the key for them, and they run these huge deficits. Well, rather, the United States runs these huge deficits, and for again, the European economy and the U.S. economy, they're more or less the same. I mean, they're the same level of economic prosperity, same level of industrialization. So therefore, when you look at how is it that there's a huge trade deficit that the America runs with Europe, then obviously you're getting an easy access to the American market. The Americans are not getting the corresponding easy access to the European market. But Chinese are particularly problematic because it is really explicitly driven export economy. And they run these huge trade surpluses, and we've discussed this in the past. Trade surpluses are a real problem, and they prove to be a real problem for the Japanese, which is, what are you going to do with the surplus? Obviously you can plant it in your own in your own country. And but that is a problem if you're also suppressing consumption in your own country, which China does, and which even the Europeans do to a certain extent. If you don't really have essentially a kind of a large consumer economy at home, then what do you do with that surplus? Well, you put it into assets. You plant it into land. You plant it into property. You buy stocks in the or assets in the United States. All of that becomes very problematic. First of all, if when you're buying up property, land and property, that gives rise to bubbles, and we know that those bubbles are a problem, as the Japanese found, because then essentially those bubbles burst, and that leads to recessions, if not depressions. So we got that problem. Or you do what the Chinese are doing, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. But again, the Belt and Road Initiative is not at all a success, for much the same reason that other countries have had difficulty, which is that, yes, you've got a huge surplus, and you invest in this Belt and Road Initiative, but the people that you're lending the money to don't have the capability to pay China back. In which case, China just has to cut its losses, just abandon it. I mean, what are you going to do? So it has to essentially cut its losses. And that's why the Belt and Road Initiative has had mixed results, to say the least. And again, the Chinese economy itself, the domestic economy, is probably, they've got a number of these bubbles, and all of it which comes about because they don't have kind of the large kind of consumer economy that can actually take care of at least some of the trade surplus that China runs. So China, in trying to take on the United States, is really not in a strong position. And I think that's what Scott Besson said. He said, you're playing poker with a pair of twos. You're not going to win. And again, Besant is a very mild-mannered person, but when he says you're just playing poker with a pair of twos, it's just saying you cannot win this, since your entire economic model depends on access to the American market. The United States does not depend on access to the Chinese market. It doesn't need the Chinese market. I mean, that's why the United States runs a huge deficit with China. I mean, I don't know what it imports something like, I don't know, $440 billion worth of goods from China, and exports, I think, 140 billion, something like that. I can't remember the exact numbers. So it's not really that much. So if it doesn't have access to the Chinese market, then essentially, okay, well, we don't have a deficit. We've cut back on our deficit. It's not a huge crisis, but for China, it is a crisis. So that's why this conflict that now the Chinese are engaged in, which no one else is doing. And this is no one else has done this. Europeans, neither Europeans nor the Japanese, nor the South Koreans have as yet retaliated. Only China has retaliated. So I think China is going to have to. I think it's going to have to climb down. There's an article in the New York Times today saying, "Oh, well, it's going to be very difficult for Xi, the strong man of China, to climb down." I doubt it. I think the Chinese will just they'll have to come up with some face-saving formula, but China will have to climb down. I don't think China can sustain. It just doesn't have an economy that can sustain itself. It depends upon access to markets, and particularly the American market. So I don't think China will prevail. Now, I have taken the view that tariffs are in principle a very good idea. I think that particularly when you have a country such as the United States, which is a big manufacturing industrial base, is runs these huge deficits. And deficits means that jobs are going overseas. I mean, basically, you're consuming more than you're producing. It means that the goods that Americans would be producing for Americans are now being produced by non-Americans, and that's the problem, that you basically got to the situation where jobs have been shipped overseas. So all sorts of things that were once manufactured in the United States by American workers are now manufactured outside of the United States by non-American workers. So that means that's loss of jobs. And people have been noting this ever since the 1980s. And people have talked about the hollowing out of America's manufacturing industry. People have talked about the hollowing out of America's middle class. Then essentially, people have talked about the great industrial cities becoming wastelands. All of that's been an ongoing thing since the 1980s. And the way that everyone has reacted, I'm going to say everyone, I'm talking about the media, the thinking people, is just so absurd. All these years of moaning about America's economic decline, all these years, this has been going on. I mean, when did Paul Kennedy write that book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers? I think it was the late 80s. And then there have been, I don't know how many of these types of books. Robert Reich has written all those books about, oh God, America's decline of our manufacturing industry. I mean, it's on and on. It's become a staple of this American moaning about the America's economic decline. Just oh God, we had had this economically dominant position in 1945. Now it's all gone. China The power in the world has moved to China. Asia is now where it's at. It's no longer America. America's just sort of museum piece. And then, so along comes Trump and said, well, I'm going to do something about it. And the response has been, everyone's becomes a follower of Ronald Reagan. It's Ronald Reagan. Free trade. We just have to do free trade. That's. But the point is, and is with free trade is that, first of all, is it free? Well, of course it isn't free. Of course it isn't free. I mean, it's been known as for years, and even during the books that highlighted the how America's manufacturing industry has been hollowed out. People have highlighted that throughout the world, the countries run trade barriers through tariffs, but even more importantly, through non-tariff trade barriers. You could absolutely cheat like mad, and then make sure that American products don't get in. And the result is, of course, American manufacturing industry, it goes into decline. And this has been known, this has been written about, but nobody really wanted to do very much about it. I mean, remember the NAFTA debate in the early 90s, and if you remember the Larry King, there was a big big debate or television debate hosted by Larry King between Al Gore and Ross Perot, because Ross Perot was one of the first, along with Pat Buchanan, who really seriously raised the issue of the free trade serves to wipe out American industry, and there was the debate, and all of the sort of the kind of the pundits, the liberal, well-to-do, intellectual, journalistic class, whatever you call them, the think tanks, the policy wonks, all were gleeful that Al Gore wiped the floor with Ross Perot. I didn't think he did, but Al Gore was quite an effective debater. I mean, you'd have to say he was tedious, he was relentless, but he was quite a good debater. And Perot was a little undisciplined, and Gore managed to make his points, whereas I think Perot had difficulties making his points. But either way, that was the high point of free trade. So all this is fantastic. We signed NAFTA. NAFTA passed overwhelmingly in Congress, and everyone took that free market view, which is free trade benefits everybody. Everybody has great out of it. And even though everyone knew there is no such thing as free trade, it never happens. It didn't matter, because everyone said, "Oh, it's like Adam Smith explained," and so on. But of course, Adam Smith did not believe free trade is good in all circumstances, and he particularly made the point that there has to be trade in a balanced way. I mean, in other words, one country sells another country wine, and then the other country, sells in exchange, I don't know, some manufactured goods. But there has to be a proper exchange. You can't have massive surpluses on one side and massive deficits on the other. That doesn't work. It can only work if there is genuine exchange. And you can't have countries which basically use trade in order to target other countries' industries. The Japanese did this. Japanese did this masterfully during the 1960s and 70s and 80s. They very strategically identified which industries they would dominate, which industries they would wipe out. The Americans were obviously the ones that were most hit. Um, and But then they did shipbuilding, they did cameras, computers, everything they did. They absolutely strategically targeted industries. The problem, of course, for the Japanese, and it's the same problem that the Chinese are now having, is that you can do this only so long as the the deficit country is going to put up with it. And the Japanese had plenty of warning from the United States that the Americans wouldn't put up with this indefinitely. And then finally, the reckoning came with the Plaza Accords in 1985, when the Americans devalued the dollar, very substantially devalued the dollar. Japanese were having a whale of a time in the early 80s because the dollar was then had a very high value. Americans were running very high interest rates to squeeze the inflation out of the economy, and the Japanese were having a whale of a time. I mean, boom, they could just buy up anything in the United States. So the moment the Americans said, "Well, we've had enough," and they devalued the dollar, that kind of brought an end the great the sort of the great miracle, the Japanese miracle. Um, and that now we have the same thing with China. China's doing the same thing. It's running this trade surpluses, massive trade surpluses, and with a view, obviously, to becoming the dominant economic power in the world. There's always a problem with that, which is that other countries take notice of that, and the Chinese knew that the United States would eventually take notice of what China was trying to do, and it was just a matter of time before the Americans would take measures against it. And China's has now real issues because now the Americans have really hit them with these very harsh tariffs. If China doesn't back down, if China then escalates with even with bigger tariffs of its own, then they could just find themselves completely locked out of the American market. I mean, that absolutely could happen. But even if that doesn't happen, the Americans would just simply hit them with even harder. If the Chinese decide, well, we're going to devalue our currency, that's just going to infuriate the Americans all the more. And I say the Americans because I don't think it's just entirely Trump. Trump was really the vehicle whereby this happened. I mean, if it weren't Trump, then it would be some other political leaders who would address this problem. And it just goes back to the point that you can't run these massive trade surpluses indefinitely. It just isn't going to work, and it's having a bad lopsided effect on your own economy. Creating bubbles and so on. But above all, you're going to find yourself locked out of the markets that you need just to sustain it. Otherwise, boom, you're locked out of the market. You just don't have anything further to do, because now you've got this huge overcapacity of your goods, and you don't know what to do. You don't have a domestic market that can absorb this overcapacity, and so you basically you go into most severe depression, and that could hit China very seriously. It's just just overcapacity. Now so I think that I think is where this is heading. I think China will have to we'll have to give up. I mean, China just isn't in the position to challenge the United States. I mean, I think unfortunately, we've been listening to too many um, Pepe Escobar types who've been telling us that already China is the number one world economy and so on. And I've, you know, said here, and I always get attacked. I always get attacked, particularly on YouTube. You know, I'm called a sinophobe or whatever. But all I say, I'm not at all a sinophobe. And on a number of issues, I'm actually very sympathetic to China. I mean, when it comes to Taiwan, I think I'm very much on China's side. Anyone who talks nonsense about Hong Kong, again, I take China's side on that. You know, and I think on when it comes to foreign policy, I think China should just throw its weight in more, you know, more decisively. I mean, I think, you know, they can't keep letting Russia do all the heavy lifting. You know, that basically, you know, opposing the unilateral American dominated world order. It always falls on Russia, and then China kind of, sort of, lamely supports Russia at the United Nations, but not in a particularly fulsome and vigorous way. But nonetheless, you know, they're kind of on the right side. It's just not vigorous enough. You can't just keep allowing Russia to do all the heavy lifting. So you know, you know, I'm sympathetic to China's position. That doesn't mean that I think China is in any way a serious economic rival of the United States. That's what I just simply say. You know, yeah, I you know, I like China's foreign policy by and large. I say it's not as strong as I would like it, but it's not the equal of the United States. And all the talk about that they're going to turn BRICS into some kind of a new economic forum, is going to become this new economic order, you know, challenging the hegemony of you know, of the West, challenging particularly the hegemony of the dollar. It cannot happen. And it cannot happen for the reason that I pointed out. The Chinese economy doesn't have, even the minimum, the requirements that you need if you're going to have, let's say, you're going to have a reserve currency. If you're going to do a reserve currency, at the very minimum, you can't have capital controls. You know, China has very, very restrictive capital controls. It's not at all easy to take, you know, put your money into China and get your money out. Very, very difficult. And it's not at all easy to exchange the yuan for other currencies, all of which you need if you're going to have a reserve currency. Now, to be honest, neither the Russians nor the Chinese have ever said that well, we're going to challenge the rule of the dollar, and we're going to have the yuan will be the global reserve currency. They haven't really said that. They left it to the Pepe Escobar types to say these things, but they're basically absurd because China just doesn't have the infrastructure necessary to have a reserve currency. Just you can't have a reserve currency. At the very minimum, you should be able to exchange currencies very easily and very quickly. At the very minimum, you can't have anyone who wants to get his capital out of China. He has to go through an enormous amount of bureaucratic rigmarole to be able to achieve that. I mean, that's why China just simply isn't in any position to challenge the United States. And the fact that it doesn't even import, the fact that it doesn't import anything from the rest of the world, or at least doesn't import very much of it, which again shows, well, it can't really be the leading economy in the world if you essentially don't do that much trade with the rest of the world. Basically, you're just driving you have an export-driven economy, and that's why I just think, unfortunately, maybe it's unfortunate. I mean, I like the idea of having alternative sources of political and economic power, I think that's a good thing. But it's one thing to say, oh, well, I think it would be good to challenge the hegemony of the dollar, challenge the hegemony of the U.S. led global economy, U.S. led financial order. Okay, fine, we can do that. That'd be a good idea. It's one thing to say that it's a good idea. It's quite another thing to say, oh, it's about to happen. Yeah, oh, next Friday sometime, the Chinese are going to do this. It's not. It isn't going to happen. And I think this confrontation with Trump is going to end with a humiliating climb down by China. And that's my prediction. So because I just look at the relative power structures, and I think that it can only have one outcome. Anyway, so that's one thing that I wanted to bring up, and the other thing that what I thought was kind of interesting was the meeting with Bibi Netanyahu in the Oval Office yesterday. Now, Trump naturally did his usual stuff about Israel, the hostages, Gaza, and so on and so forth. But he's basically climbed down from the original position that he was just going to remove the Palestinians from Gaza, because now he's sort of said, well, we can't do it coercively. But the issue was, and why Bibi made this trip to Washington, was this tariff. Trump imposed a 17% tariff on Israel, and that's of course quite interesting because Israel, we know Israel is a special relationship, and everybody loves in Washington, everyone loves Israel. And Trump, of course, he has done all these things for Israel. He's moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He's recognized the Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights. He walked out of the Iran nuclear deal. So he's done all this for Israel, and then he supported the essentially not only supported, he encouraged Israel to walk away from to abandon the ceasefire, which he himself, Trump, on just the day before he became president, Trump had urged Israel to undertake the ceasefire. So basically he encouraged Netanyahu to walk away from it, and Netanyahu duly walked away from it. So given all of that, it was on the face of it kind of surprising that he hit Israel with a 17% tariff. So across the board, he did the 10%, and then but Israel got the 17%. So the question was, well, will Bibi get Trump to relent on that 17% tariff? And the answer was no. He didn't get any break from Trump. And in fact, Trump's Trump's statement, comments to Netanyahu were very pointed. Very, very pointed. So let me just read out from the transcript what Trump said. Here we have a reporter. Mr. President, do you plan to reduce the tariffs that your government put on Israeli goods? 17%. Trump, where? Reporter, on Israeli goods, the 17%. Do you plan to raise? President Trump, well, we're talking about a whole new trade. Maybe not. Maybe not. Don't forget, we help Israel a lot. We give Israel $4 billion a year. That's a lot. My congratulations, by the way. But we give Israel billions of dollars a year. Billions. It's one of the highest of. We give a lot of countries money. Now, this is pretty blunt. You suddenly you talk to Trump, bring up that, hey, you're going to cut the 17% tariff you've just hit, and then he suddenly brings up, well, we give Israel $4 billion a year, and of course it's a lot more than that, because there's all sorts of off budget donations. I mean, how much money has the United States given Israel since October the 7th, 2023? That's a lot of money. A lot of money. I mean, so it's a hell of a lot more than $4 billion a year. So Trump is being very, very generous to Israel by saying, "Oh, we'll give you $4 billion a year." So you want to basically be grateful to us because we give you $4 billion a year, and now you come back and say, "Oh, can you remove this 17% tariff?" What's interesting about that is that it's not usual for American politicians, let alone an American president, to bring up this annual gift that's granted to Israel. In fact, it's never brought up. We have, Israel is a great ally. We have a special relationship. Israel and the United States are joined at the hip. We love Israel. Israel has a right to its security. Israel has a right to do whatever it needs to do. Israel has a right to exist. Nobody ever brings up all this money that you're giving to Israel, and what are you getting out of it? And Trump seems to be hinting at that, at this very thing. What are we getting out of it? Obviously, not very much. If he says that we're going to hit you with a 17% tariff. Notice also the way this is just the his word choice. He says, maybe not, first of all. Then it says, don't forget, we help Israel a lot. We help Israel a lot. No, there's no more partnership here. We give Israel. We just give you. We give you. It's like somebody's giving you. You're helping out. Here, we're going to give you some money. We give Israel $4 billion a year. That's a lot. And then he says, sneeringly, my congratulations, by the way. That's a sneer. Oh, my congratulations. We give you $4 billion. And by saying my congratulations, by the way, it's kind of saying, hey, you're ripping us off. And my congratulations, you've been very clever at doing this. My congratulations, by the way, but we give Israel billions of dollars a year, billions. It's one of the highest of it. We give a lot of countries money. It says it's one of the highest. Now, this isn't incidentally the first time that Trump has kind of blurted out that Israel is just very, very ungrateful. That America gives all this aid, money, whatever, diplomatic support. Just list all the things that Israel, armaments, everything. And then Israel comes back for more. And he's complained about this before. He said, I barely got something out of the door for Israel, and they're already back in the Oval Office asking me for more. So this he's suddenly, you can see he's getting annoyed here. Annoyed at the end and say, hey, we're doing all this for you, and now you have a nerve about to start talking about removing this 17% tariff, because now we're saying we're concerned about American workers, jobs for Americans, and you can see at this moment that Trump really doesn't have any particular attachment to Israel. He's not a make Israel great again kind of right winger, and there are so many of them in Congress and around Trump, but Trump himself isn't. And so when you bring that up with him about the 70% tariff, he said, hey, that's American workers. And that's my responsibility is to American workers. We give Israel an awful lot, but here we're talking about American workers, and that's who I'm supposed to represent. Anyway, let's go on with that news conference or presser. It wasn't quite a news conference, and he then says, "You wouldn't believe it if I said we give Afghanistan a lot of money, do you? That was a Biden deal. Another Biden deal. Not only did he embarrass us with that, but they gave them billions of dollars. Afghanistan, right? So, but now we take good care of our friends and we don't take care of our enemies. We're not taking care of our enemies anymore, but we do take care of our friends." But now you see what he's done here is liken the situation of Israel to Afghanistan. So, I mean, that's a real basket case. Well, we gave Afghanistan a lot of money, and we gave Israel a lot of money. Then he says, and then of course we get the subject of the talks with Iran came up, and this was quite interesting because Israel was caught by surprise by Trump's announcement. Trump hadn't let Israel know that he will be launching talks in Oman this coming Saturday on Iran and a new nuclear agreement. So Israel didn't really know this, and Israel isn't particularly happy about the prospect of talks. So he suddenly said, and he said that there'll be direct talks between the United States and Iran. Iran denied this and said, well, there will be talks, but they will be indirect talks. In other words, they may be in the vicinity, in the same hotel, but there will be an intermediary. So in other words, Americans and Iranians won't actually be sitting at the same table. There'll be a mediator between them. Now, whatever is the truth, whether they can be direct talks or indirect talks, but there will be talks starting this Saturday. Now, Israel really isn't very happy about that because Israel much prefers to launch attacks against Iran now. But anyway, so the reporter says, a lot of people think that these talks are not going to lead anywhere because the Iranians will never give up their nuclear program. If diplomacy fails, is the United States, under your leadership, ready to take military action to destroy the Iranian nuclear program and remove this threat? This is what journalists are always doing. They're always eager to start a war or something. They always want to get, what happens if this talks don't work? Are you ready to start bombing? And Trump responds, I think if the talks aren't successful with Iran, I think Iran is going to be in great danger. And I hate to say it, great danger because they can't have nuclear weapons. So is that a yes? It's not a complicated formula. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. That's all it is. Can't have us ready right now. We have countries that have nuclear power that shouldn't have it. Well, this is a really an interesting issue because if you recall, the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, had said a couple of weeks ago that essentially Iran will not be allowed to have a nuclear energy program. In other words, all of it would have to be dismantled. That is really unacceptable to the Iranians. I mean, Iran is now. Trump didn't quite say that, but the Iranians will not accept a deal that involves their giving up nuclear energy, and it's clearly would be a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because the Non-Proliferation Treaty made clear that all countries that give up nuclear weapons, basically you sign on and say you will not have nuclear weapons, nonetheless you always have the possibility of developing nuclear energy. The peaceful use of nuclear energy is permissible under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. If that's taken away from you, then there's really no point in belonging to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And Netanyahu has said, "Oh well, when it comes to Iran, I want the Libya option." And of course, the Libya option was in 2003, I think, when I think Gaddafi was very nervous because of what had happened to Saddam Hussein. Basically, he agreed to dismantle all of his nuclear program. So that was in 2003, and of course, then 8 years later, as anyone could have predicted, 8 years later, the United States led NATO into a bombing campaign to drive him from power. I mean, it was obvious that that's what was going to happen, and that's in fact what the United States did. The moment Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program, then he became vulnerable to attack. Now, the Iranians know this, and that's why they're not going to agree to this. There's no way they're going to agree to a peaceful to give. No, they're not going to agree to giving up peaceful use of nuclear energy. Now, so that I think is that's out of the question. I mean, I think if Trump could go back to the JCPOA type agreement, whereby Iran would still be allowed to enrich uranium, but the enriched uranium that Iran today possesses, I think it's 60% or whatever it is, Iran would have to give that up. I mean, that which is what the JCPOA was about. That basically all of the enriched uranium that Iran had at the time in 2015, it gave all of that to the Russians, and so Iran was only allowed to enrich uranium up to 3%. Now, a deal like that, I guess, basically it's the same thing as the JCPOA. Iran would take a deal along those lines. The probably, first of all, I mean, for Iran, they would have to trust the Americans, which is that's a big very dubious request. After all, they signed an agreement in 2015, and then 3 years later, the Americans walked away from the agreement, led by President Trump. President Trump, who's now offering an agreement. But at least something like that, essentially a version of the JCPOA, would, I think, be acceptable to the Iranians. They would take it, say, okay, we can enrich uranium up to 3%. Okay, and then whatever the enriched uranium that we have at the moment, we'll give them up. We'll give it up, give it to the Russians. But in exchange, the United States would have to lift all sanctions against Iran. Now, is Trump going to go for an agreement like that? I don't know. Trump has to come up with some agreements. I mean, because I think the Russia-Ukraine talks are not going particularly well. I mean, they're indirect talks, but they're not really yielding anything at the moment. So if this also doesn't yield anything, then what does Trump do? Trump could, I mean, bomb Iran. I think that's a possibility. I mean, they've now installed the B-2 bombers on Diego Garcia. They've installed these Patriot anti-missile systems in Israel, the THAAD anti-missile systems in Israel. So in some ways they're making the signaling to Iran that they are ready to bomb Iran. Now, if Trump does that, if he does bomb Iran, I don't think Iran will retaliate. I think that would be a foolish step. I don't think Iran will retaliate, but I think Iran will then walk out from the non-proliferation treaty. I think then he'll just say, "That's it, we're done." And just as North Korea did, I mean, North Korea was never bombed, but North Korea did withdraw from the non-proliferation treaty. So the Iran would withdraw from that, and I would assume they would begin building nuclear weapons, and they may already have that. I mean, we don't know exactly what Iran has. I mean, Iran claims that it has no intention of developing nuclear weapons. The CIA and the recent intelligence assessment, global threat assessment report by the U.S. intelligence agency says they don't think Iran has made a decision to have nuclear weapons. But if Trump does bomb Iran, then I have to believe that. I don't think they're going to retaliate. I mean, because they don't want a war with the United States. I mean, that's just that would be foolish and destructive. So they don't want a war with the United States. But I think they will walk away from the non-proliferation treaty. In which case, essentially, the world becomes well. I don't know whether stable or unstable, but essentially, we'll be we're going to be in a new. The new situation. But I thought that Trump's comments about these talks with Iran were, I think, quite positive. I had to say, it sounds to me like they're going to come with an agreement. I mean, I think that I don't think he's just going to abandon this. I think the Iranians do want some kind of an agreement. I don't think they don't want to get themselves into any kind of an armed conflict with the United States. I think an agreement would be doable as long as Trump doesn't demand of them that they give up nuclear energy. Now, I think the people around Trump, like Mike Waltz, will say, yeah, we got to basically Iran has to give up its nuclear energy. I think that's not doable. But something like the JCPOA is, a version of that is doable, and I thought that some of Trump's comments would suggest that he would accept that. He's just saying, well, it's not acceptable that they have nuclear weapons. Well, that's a standard American position. But he didn't say during this press availability that we're going to demand that they dismantle their nuclear energy program. Anyway, let's just finish off with that meeting with Netanyahu, which was again, I think it's interesting. Netanyahu could not have walked away from that meeting a happy man. He was not a happy man. So then we have a reporter from Haaretz who says Turkey claims it will stabilize the situation in Syria. Israel doesn't want Turkey to influence Syria. What do you think? Do you think Turkey's influence in Syria can actually make it a better, more peaceful country, or vice versa? So we know that the Israelis are not happy with Turkey becoming ever more heavily involved in Syria and building bases inside Syria, housing Turkish military personnel. Israel is not at all happy about that. and it's already bombed bases where there weren't any Turks there, but they were clearly built by Turks. So Israel is making clear that they're not accepting a Turkish military presence um, in Syria, other than right up in the north, but certainly in the middle of Syria, they're not accepting a Turkish military presence. So President Trump says, "Well, I have great relations with a man named Erdogan. Have you heard of him?" He always says this. Have you heard of him? Reporter, yes. President Trump, and I happen to like him, and he likes me, and I know the press will get very angry. He likes Erdogan, but I do, and he likes me, and we've never had a problem, and we've gone through a lot, and we've never had a problem. So again, this is not at all anything Netanyahu was particularly happy about. Now remember, Turkey certainly has worked together with Israel through this whole Gaza thing, and they're getting oil from Azerbaijan, and Turkey is facilitating this. So Turkey has really done nothing at all for the Palestinians. But nonetheless, Israel is not happy about any major presence by Turkey inside Syria. And then, now, with that being said, Trump goes on, I believe it was Turkey, and I said that to him. I said, congratulations, you've done what nobody's been able to do in 2,000 years. You've taken over Syria with different names, but the same thing. I said, you've taken it over. He's taken it over through surrogates. I don't know where he's getting his history from. I mean, the Turks did rule over Syria for for centuries, but okay. He goes, no, 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 it wasn't me. I said, it was you, but that's okay. You don't have to say. Well, sort of, maybe it was me. Okay. Well, what he did, he's a tough guy. He's very smart. And he did something that nobody was able to do. You know, you got to hand it to him. So he's talking here about the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad. So he's saying, well, he's a tough guy. He did it. You know, kudos to him. And then Trump goes on, any problem that you have with Turkey, I think I can solve. This is to Netanyahu. Any problem that you have with Turkey, I think I can solve. I mean, as long as you're reasonable. You have to be reasonable. We have to be reasonable. You have to be reasonable. We have to be reasonable. It's not exactly a very fulsome endorsement of the Israeli position. You have to be reasonable. We'll sort out any problems you might have with Turkey, as long as you're reasonable. You know, but we have our own interests with Turkey. You know, Turkey is a NATO ally, and we have, you know, we kind of like Erdogan, and we're not just going to automatically take your side against Turkey. Now, what that really gives us is that Israel really has a carte blanche on one thing and one thing only. It can do whatever it likes to the Palestinians. When it comes to Palestinians, they basically have a carte blanche. They can do whatever they want. Trump, and basically that's true about any American president, they really don't care very much about the Palestinians. Israel can, you know, do whatever you do in Gaza. You know, Americans, you know, they might say, well, I got human rights, and but ultimately Americans aren't going to raise any problems. When it comes to anything else, Israel is told that that's out of bounds. When it comes to the American economy, he said, no, you're going to pay tariffs like everyone else. You're not going to just, do anything detrimental to American workers. When it comes to Turkey, they said, no. I mean, that's, I like Erdogan. He's a good guy. I like what he did in Syria. I could sort out any problems that you have with Erdogan, but you have to be reasonable. So when he says you have to be reasonable when it comes with Erdogan, he's pretty much saying Turkey is in Syria to stay. Turkey will stay in Syria. Turkey will move its military into Syria, and Trump really doesn't care very much about that. Israel has to be reasonable and not expect any real American assistance if they get themselves into any kind of a armed conflict with Turkey. So it's a very interesting thing. I mean, that's why I think, and I should have mentioned the F-35. Israel has been pressing Trump not to sell the F-35 fighter aircraft to Turkey, and Trump said, "Yeah, we're going to sell them the F-35s." Turkey is a NATO member, and we're gonna give them the F-35. We don't care what you say. So this is what makes this very interesting. Here is Israel, which has this sway over American politicians, and over the Trump administration, over all the expulsions of foreign students for no reason other than they're protesting against Israel. That apparently can get you thrown out of the country just protesting against Israel. You can protest against the United States, but you can't protest against Israel because then you suddenly are deemed anti-Semitic. And so that all this is done for Israel only when it comes to the issue of the Palestinians. You can do whatever you want with the Palestinians, anything like that. Bomb. Israel has a carte blanche. So much so that we're going to keep people out of the country for for saying mean things about Israel. But anything else, and basically Israel does not get the support of the United States. So that's all they've got. It means essentially that Israel has its role assigned to it in the region, but if you try going beyond that, then basically Americans aren't going to support it. Now, Obama had more or less said the same thing at the time of the signing of the JCPOA. Remember, Netanyahu had come to the country and protested and so on, and Obama kind of ignored it and just still went ahead with the JCPOA. But because he said, "Hey, this is in America's interest," and I'm not that bothered about Israel. Then Trump, of course, he embraced the Zionist cause. But you can see with Trump, there's another issue for him. So for him, the issue of the economy, tariffs, that's more important to him than Israel. Never had a particular attachment to Israel. He's not Jewish. It's just never been his particular thing. Tariffs it has been his thing, and now you can see that even on the issue of Erdogan, he's saying that, well, Erdogan, I mean, we're going to have to deal with him. He matters to us. He's he's an important leader, and we're not going to ask him to leave Syria. Israel may like him to leave Syria, but the Americans are not going to help Israel to oust the Turkish presence from Syria. But anyway, let's then look at our locals page. The people, the Gagglers, who contribute to the dogs. Because we really talked before about these really ferocious dogs who who is, as I said, there's this dog in my building, this very small terrier, and I always thought terriers were kind of they're small, kind of cute, toy-like dogs, and and thought, oh, then they're not a problem. But this terrier, the moment he sees me, just from a distance, he just goes absolutely crazy. I mean, the owner has to hold his leash very tight because otherwise he would just go straight at me. Yeah, I mean he's done that before. He bit my leg once, um, and but and I kind of wonder why this dog has this extraordinary animus towards me. I've never done anything to that dog, but somehow it just goes crazy at the sight of me. And I have a feeling that it's Peter's dogs. They kind of they've been spreading malicious rumors about me, probably to do with the tip jar and my poor stewardship of the tip jar. But there's no other reason that I can figure. But anyway, Judy, always very interesting, all your comments. So thank you very much for for your generosity. I find it very interesting that um, Judy has you posted something interesting the other day about the new Bretton Woods, where there's going to be a new Bretton Woods on the agenda, and this is something that Judy has brought up before, and I have expressed skepticism because I somehow think that this gold issue is still going to, if the heart of any new Bretton Woods system would be gold and putting the dollar on a gold standard. And I think that Judy Shelton, whom Judy quotes, I mean, she wants to go back to gold. I don't know how that can be done because I think that it's going to be the same problem that the Americans faced back in 1971 when Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, because the countries that were running, even then, they were running these trade surpluses with the United States, grew less and less confident in the dollar. You might say the United States had inflation, and therefore they were worried that the dollar reserves that they were holding in their central banks were losing value. So they converted them into gold. And gradually, the Americans started running out of gold. I posted on a part of our book club a rather interesting book written about that by Jeffrey Garten, that the weekend when Nixon and his advisors decided to take the dollar off the gold standard. So that's why I'm thinking that something. I mean, Trump promised that he would visit Fort Knox to see how much gold there really is in Fort Knox. I mean, he just said, "Well, I'm going to do an audit. I'm going to go in there with Musk and do an audit." That hasn't happened yet. So that would be very interesting as to whether there really is the gold at Fort Knox that Fort Knox claims there is. Um, but I think that's going to be the same sort of problems. However, I mean, if the the plan is to do something other than a return to gold, then it's quite possible that Trump and Scott Bessent would be interested in setting up a new Bretton Woods system. But they would have to give up certain things. I mean, you can't have a Bretton Woods system and use the dollar as punishment, and which is what has happened really over the past few years, which is essentially using the dollar. So the countries that are under sanction from the United States and they have dollar holdings, the United States can just simply seize those dollar holdings. I mean, you can't do that. You can't. That's just not compatible with any new Bretton Woods. So as long as you can give that up, then maybe you can work out some kind of a new financial order. I mean, I think it's very interesting, and it is interesting that Scott Bessent has said that he is interested in a new Bretton Woods. So we'll see. But anyway, thank you, Judy, for for bringing up this the subject. It is kind of interesting whether you can put together some kind of a new order of financial stability, because what's happening now is not exactly conducive to financial stability. And I don't mean the tariffs, but I mean I think seizing countries' dollar assets, I think that's not conducive to financial stability. Anyway, Judy says Kirill Dmitriev. He's the guy who he's the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and he was in D.C. recently. He was involved in the negotiations with the Trump administration. He was involved in Riyadh when they talked to uh, Waltz and Rubio. So he's a very senior figure. And so Kirill Dmitriev has issued a statement supporting Trump's tariffs. Let me read out. It's this tweet that he sent out. Where is it? Yeah, he sends out on tariffs. It would be easy to ignore the ballooning 30 trillion plus debt and growing trade deficits. Yeah, absolutely. It's a real issue for the United States, and that's no question. I mean, that is driving Trump and Scott Bessent. You can't go on running these trade deficits, running these budget deficits, and they are connected, and having this huge debt. I mean, ultimately, it's not sustainable. And then, like past presidents did, so easy to ignore the ballooning, like past presidents did, just kick the can to future generation. But Trump's taking bold steps to stop U.S. bankruptcy, bring back jobs, spark investment, and rebuild the economy. That's leadership. So I like that comment. I do think that I'm sympathetic to this position, and I really find it quite ridiculous when you get these pundits who are quite happy with China running tariffs, who are quite happy with China running a kind of a protectionist economy, or they're quite happy with countries having non-tariff trade barriers. But the moment the United States does that, the United States starts saying, okay, well, you run tariffs, we're going to run tariffs, then immediately that's something horrific. That's destabilizing the economy. That's a terrible threat and everything. And it's I find it good that this Russian accepts that, and I think Russians should want a global order in which nations pursue their own interests. In which nation says, yeah, we are running deficits and debt that is just unsustainable. That basically you just can't do it forever. And that's part of when you pursue your national interest. And I think that's something Russia should think about. That Russia can work with that, and I think everyone should be able to work with the United States that wants the best for the United States, and therefore, you get these these kind of alt media types who are now sounding like CNN or New York Times or MSNBC. These are alt media. You think, okay, well, they should be on saying, hey, they should support the United States or anyone else following their own national interests. You've been complaining all these years about the West and the New World Order, not the rule, not New World Order. That was George H.W. Bush. The rules-based order and all these demands that the Western powers, chiefly in the United States, made against other countries because of this order, this neoliberal order that was being created. And here's the United States now saying, oh, we're not interested in any of these liberal order. What we're interested in is making sure that Americans have jobs. We're making sure that Americans live as well as they once did. We're trying to recover, revitalize, the American industry and the American way of life. Trying to go back to, kind of a life that Americans once led. And this has been greeted with this ridiculous hysteria. And I thought, well, this is very odd. I mean, you're supposed to be this lefty types, alt media, and you think, well, wouldn't this be something that you would favor? I mean, you obviously don't like neoliberalism. You don't like this rules-based order. You don't like the idea of turning this rules-based order against miscreants. And now here is when don't you feel comfortable when countries are only preoccupied with themselves and their own interests, their own citizens? But in fact, that suddenly it's greeted with this ridiculous hostility by people who are advocates on behalf of China. So all this time, everything else, when China did this, then that would be when China has pursued these goals, that's fine. Oh yeah, great. Great. All this time. If tariffs are so bad, such a terrible idea, well, how come China has tariffs and China did very well by it? China, grew in prosperity, which according to that. So that was so all these things that when China did it, oh, that's great. But when America does it, that's horrific. Even as Dmitriev points out, that ultimately this is it hasn't done America a lot of good. It hasn't done good in terms of rising living standards and life expectancy and everything else for Americans, but it hasn't worked in any fiscal way for Americans. So what he's saying here, and I find it heartening that should be the Russian government position, because I think as long as Russia pursues its interests and America recognizes Russia pursuing its interests, then I think correspondingly Russia should recognize and welcome when America pursues its interests, and should not suddenly start adopting this hostile positions or start echoing what the Chinese are saying or anything like that. I think Russia should recognize, yeah, well, okay, you have your interests, you have to pursue those interests, and we'll pursue ours. Recognize our particular concerns, we will recognize your concerns. So that I think should be the Russian position. I'm not sure it is. I mean, I've been looking at RT, and I'm not sure that that everybody is on board. Too many of them still sound like MSNBC and CNN. So, but I found this tweet really heartening. Anyway, thank you so much, Judy, as always, and look forward to more of your contributions. On on the new Bretton Woods or anything else. So, thank you, Judy. And then Vic Shakapopoulos says, "Dear George, I don't want to make this podcast about JFK, but I listened to your April Fool's Day take on the JFK assassination, and frankly, I hope indeed it was a joke. If the fact of keeping the files classified for over 60 years is not convincing you that there was something stinking, then the second obvious question is, why would Ruby, member of the Jewish mob, kill Oswald? What was his motive?" And then Vic goes on, or I'll read the whole thing. "Taking a lawyerly position, where is the evidence like yours, is counterproductive. The evidence is classified, plus many witnesses have been killed or died by now. How could anyone present a definitive court-like case in these circumstances? No one can point a finger and say the CIA, Mossad, mob, Pentagon did it for sure, but all of them had motives to do so, stronger than Oswald had anyway. The Oswald character was himself an enigma and might as well have been controlled in a Manchurian candidate way. After all, the MK Ultra experiment had already run by that time, And that movie looks like a hint to me. Wouldn't be the first time Hollywood predicts a political event. The official story is not based on strong evidence itself, so why would you be convinced that there was no conspiracy? Anyway, I recommend Parenti's take on the JFK assassination. It delves into the funny details of the whole official story. Well, I mean, I don't want to repeat everything that I said during that April Fool's podcast. My view is that the very fact that they kept this, um, a lot of the files closed all these years, I don't think it's that significant. A lot of these files had dealt with things that were embarrassing to the U.S. government. A lot to do with the CIA plots in Cuba. I mean, the CIA was trying to assassinate Castro on the orders of Jack and Bobby Kennedy. The CIA was making use of the mob in Cuba in order to kill Castro, in order to make Cuba ungovernable, in order to create crises in Cuba. This is all was very embarrassing, and basically that's the reason that they didn't want a lot of this material coming out. But there are also other things. I mean, the fact that they were spying on Oswald, and therefore they were spying on the Cuban embassy on Mexico. I mean, they were eavesdropping on all conversations taking place in the Cuban embassy in Mexico. So, in other words, there's a lot of information, tons of it, that the United States regards as classified and is not for public consumption. So I don't think there's anything surprising by the fact that they've been reluctant to publish this documentation. The point is this: no evidence has come forward, none whatsoever, that there was anyone else involved in this assassination other than Oswald. There's just been, I mean, if you're going to criticize the Warren Commission report, okay, you can do that. You can always poke holes in a report that was basically rushed. I mean, they obviously rushed it. People wanted to know answers, and Johnson, who set up the Warren Commission, he wanted answers. He wanted this published very quickly before the presidential election of 1964, and he was rushed. And so, you can always find flaws in there. That isn't good enough if you're going to present an alternative hypothesis. So you've got to first of all tell us who did it. Was it the CIA? Was it Mossad? Was it the Pentagon? Was it the Russians? Was it the mafia? I mean, who did it? You can't just simply say, well, it was one of them. But somebody had to have done it. Somebody had to have done all this. It's not an easy thing and it's a very dangerous thing to do, to try to assassinate a president. So somebody had to have done it. Now, the alternative is Oswald. Oswald's motives were very, very clear. Oswald had been a communist. He was a committed communist, so much so he went to the Soviet Union and tried to defect to the Soviet Union. He asked for asylum in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets initially said no. And then he attempted to commit suicide, and then he lived some years in the Soviet Union. They provided him with a Russian wife, who was the daughter of a Soviet general. He came back to the United States. He attempted to assassinate General William Walker, who was head of the John Birch Society. So you can see he was intensely political. He felt very strongly against what Kennedy was doing in Cuba. He felt very, very strongly that Kennedy was trying to killed Castro in an attempt to overthrow a communist ruler of Cuba. And the general, this William Walker, or was it William Walker or Edwin Walker? Um, he was Edwin Walker. It was a John Birch Society. He was a very intense anti-communist. And again, you can see Oswald wanted to kill him. Jack Ruby. Okay, let's say Jack Ruby. What's the point you're going to make about Jack Ruby? I don't know why Jack Ruby killed Oswald. I mean, probably felt very emotionally distraught about the assassination of a president. But let's say it's a mystery, and I can say I don't know why Jack Ruby killed Oswald. What does that prove? The Mossad, what did Jack Ruby? Did he have a connection with the Mossad? Did he have a connection with the CIA? You're right. He had a mob. He had the gangster connections. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you now is that the thesis you're going with, that it was the mafia killed Kennedy? But let's say it's the mafia. Why would the mafia want to kill Jack Kennedy? Now, it's true that Bobby Kennedy had gone after the mafia. He did that, but that was Bobby. I mean, then if you're going to kill anyone, then go after Bobby. This wasn't particularly Jack's thing. It was Bobby who made this into one of, essentially, he was planning a presidential run himself, and so he decided that this was going to be his thing of going after the mafia. He went after Jimmy Hoffa and everything else. He was essentially building up a reputation for being a tough guy, taking on the mob. So go after Bobby. That would make a lot of sense. The problem that all of those people that one mentions, CIA, the mafia, the Mossad, the Pentagon, none of them really seem to have a particularly strong case to kill Kennedy. Kennedy was a very conventional Cold War president. He was a Cold War president. He didn't do anything at all to challenge Cold War thinking, Cold War assumption. He just didn't do it. The only thing people can ever point to is that he made that one speech at the American University, in June 1963. But that speech was far less pointed than, say, Eisenhower's military-industrial complex speech. I mean, the military-industrial complex speech, admittedly, he was already leaving office, but nonetheless, Kennedy didn't bring that up. It was a speech. It was after the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a lot of relief that that the people really were afraid that there would be a nuclear war in October 1962, and there was certain good feeling after that, and then Kennedy, addressed that feeling, and he probably would have pursued a détente policy, but détente was pursued anyway. All the presidents after Kennedy pursued détente policy, so there was no change in the policy. Johnson pursued a certain détente policy, going all the way to meeting Kosygin in 1967 at Glassboro, New Jersey. And then, of course, under Nixon, détente really kicked in. So again, I'd have to look at where's the motive? What's the motive for killing Kennedy? So because there's no real motive, because there's no evidence that Kennedy was anything other than a fairly standard issue Cold War president, a mythology has grown up around Kennedy, peddled obviously by his nephew, Bobby Jr., and the likes of, Viva Frei and Robert Barnes and Tucker Carlson and Ron Paul and others. But it's a myth. They're presenting a myth. It's not. None of that has any bearing on the real, actual Jack Kennedy. I posted on the locals page Seymour Hersh's book on Kennedy. Look that up, The Dark Side of Camelot, and that'll give you a good sense of who Kennedy was, what policies he's pursued, and there's nothing there that would persuade anyone to think, well, we have to get rid of this guy because he's really dangerous for us. There's nothing there. So I'm sorry. It's a nice idea that there was some dark conspiracy. Incidentally, it wasn't just the Warren Commission report. The House Assassinations Committee in the 1970s reopened the Kennedy assassination. They published a lengthy report. They pretty much confirmed everything that the Warren Commission published. So there's basically been two official reports. But anyway, thank you, Vic Shakopoulos. Thank you. And Marx 2023 says, anyone who thinks that Trump can win a trade war with China is a fool. America is a nation of 350 million, and there are 8 billion people in the world. Well, yes, but America is the dominant economy in the world. It dominates finance, and if you're running a trade deficit, you have it over the country that runs the trade surplus. If you've got a trade surplus, you are wholly dependent on the country with the deficit. America doesn't need China. Absolutely doesn't need China. China needs America. That's a simple equation. America can live without the Chinese economy. But China cannot live without the American economy. So that's why if there's going to be a confrontation between America and China, China will lose. I will guarantee it. China will lose this confrontation. Anyway, Vic Shakopoulos says April the 30th marks the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. Yeah, that's right. It's a great heroic day. It's the 1970, April the 30th, 1975. You're absolutely right. So I propose to hold a movie club about the Vietnam War around that date. That's a very good idea, actually. Let me write that down. That's a very, very good idea. The Vietnam War movie club. Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, there obviously been a number of movies about Vietnam. And so, yeah, I mean, there are, as you said, there are obvious choices. I can only do 8 on the locals page. So, I mean, you mentioned Apocalypse Now, yes. Platoon, yes. Full Metal Jacket, yeah. The Deer Hunter. I would propose lesser-known films like the one of my personal favorites, Hearts and Minds, yeah. Coming Home, 1978, Hamburger Hill, Casualties of War. Well, I think that's very interesting. The films that you have mentioned is, I mean, Coming Home isn't specific. I mean, obviously it's about Vietnam. It's about a Vietnam vet, but it's not actually the war itself. I mean, it's just this guy coming home. There's John Voight and Jane Fonda and back in America. Hamburger Hill, I think that definitely is very much about the war. Casualties of War, that was that's with Michael J. Fox. I've seen that. It was not one of the best. The Deer Hunter. It's a very good film. Not sure it has very much realism to it. One film that you didn't mention there is, of course, Good Morning Vietnam with Robin Williams, which I think is not bad because it captures the atmosphere of Vietnam rather well, as does Full Metal Jacket. Captures the atmosphere of Vietnam very well, but but the others are, I mean, like Apocalypse Now and the Deer Hunter. I mean, they're not. I mean, obviously they're set in Vietnam. Then they're not specific about the Vietnam War. I mean, they probably will be in the poll. I mean, I would, but again, Apocalypse Now is more about how corruption of American innocence, Americans exploiting immigrants, naive immigrants, uh, and so it was. And then that's the Deer Hunter, and then in Apocalypse Now. Well, I mean, that's just an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's novel. But yeah, I mean, they're absolutely good choices. Hearts and Minds. I like the idea of Hearts and Minds and Hamburger Hill. I think I'd like to do Good Morning Vietnam. I think I'm not a huge fan of Robin Williams, but I thought that as but if people can think of some other Vietnam films. I mean, there have been a number of them. I can't think of them at the moment. So, but yeah, those are pretty good to start off with. But I think it's an excellent idea to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. I wonder whether there have been any or Vietnamese movies about the Vietnam War, or at least I'm sure there have been, but any of them that have appeared in the West. Marx 2023 says Scott Bessent is a gay that lives in a pink house who worked for Soros. Chinese exports to America is 3% of its GDP. And 40% of Chinese exports are American companies. Well, the issue here is that American companies should be producing in America. That's what Trump his plan is all about. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So and then Mark says the greedy capitalists sent the jobs to China. Yeah, the American market is made up of 80% service and finance. The remainder is agriculture and military. Did I leave out death and destruction? Well, like everything else, that doesn't mean that you can't do something about it. I think this is an undesirable state of affairs. You need a manufacturing industry. You want to be a great power, you need a manufacturing base. And it's been clear for some time that America needs not just a manufacturing base, it needs the whole production chain in the United States. It's clearly ridiculous that you now are essentially assembling cars in the United States, but they have to go to Mexico, and then they get exported back to the United States, and then they go to Canada, and then they export it back to the United States. I mean, this is absurd. You used to be able to go from start to finish. You manufactured your cars in the United States, and I think it's perfectly reasonable that Americans want to go back to that. They want to say, hey, we used to have Detroit famous throughout the world. You start your car, you manufacture your car from start to finish in the United States. You don't have to take them to Canada first and then bring them back, and then to Mexico and bring them back. I mean, you don't do any of that. So, Mark says George's dream. We've got American hair dryer. Dream on, George. Not going to happen. It is going to happen. I think that you can still do all these things like hair dryers and T-shirts and everything. I mean, that's why I think when they talk about robotics and automation, you're not going to have kind of elderly women knitting and as you think of these sweatshops. That's not. You don't need sweatshops. These things can be done through robotics. Absolutely, there's no need for that to be manufactured elsewhere. And then George, I'd like to repeat a comment I made on your live stream. 1st of April isn't saying income tax is the most dubious tax of all. A moon-sized question mark over all fair governance of a welfare state, of a national delivery of health care, provision of energy and water, and fair equitable. Well, all I meant when I said dubious is that in terms of taxation, I mean, the governments tax anything that moves, and even if it doesn't move, the government taxes it. Um, and of the taxes that it raises, the most questionable, I think, is income, because income tax, because essentially it is your labor. This is you devote yourself to your work. Most of your existence is involved in working, and the government just simply takes 50% of it. Boom, just takes it, and you don't get to approve of it. You just get to hand the money over. And if you choose not to hand the money over, then you go to prison. And so that's why I was saying that of all the taxes we have, and remember, even if you own stock, the stock is taxed at a lower rate than income is. That's why rich people don't get paid with income. They get paid with stock, and then with the carried interest loophole, they they get to avoid paying taxes. Now, my point was that sales tax um, is I think is clearly much more acceptable than an income tax. Now, because you always have a choice of whether you want to pay this or not. So you get cigarettes. Hey, that ridiculously expensive a pack of cigarettes. Almost all of that money that you're paying for a pack of cigarettes is going to the government. So you have a choice. Do I want to buy this and send all this money to the government, or I can skip and spend my money on something else? So you always have a choice. And the same thing that with imports or tariffs. Tariffs are just simply a tax on imports. And so you always have that choice. What do I want to pay this, or am I going to spend my money on something else? And so that's why I said that the income, with income, you just don't have any choice. It's something that's so fundamental to you which is what work is, fundamental to everybody's existence. But however, 50% of it and more is then handed over to the government. That's all I meant by it's very dubious. Whereas in tariffs, you just say I don't want to pay it. I'm not going to pay the money to for this expensive car. And I think when and somebody I think rightly, because I brought up the issue of champagne, Trump says we're going to hit champagne with high tariffs. And I said, well, okay, well then you have a choice then of buying American sparkling wine. And then somebody I think rightly said that I think people are still going to pay money for champagne, and I think that's right. That even when you raise the price of champagne, people are going to pay for it because it's a quality product. And I think that's the thing. Even with the tariff, they're going to pay that money because it's a quality product. I mean, it's champagne. It's champagne. I mean, it's a better product than American sparkling wine. But nonetheless, you have a choice, and that's all I said. This with dubious with an income tax. We've got used to it, and they have it everywhere. Everywhere, somebody hits you. The government hits you with an income tax. There's nowhere where you don't have an income tax, and wherever it's done, I think it's always a very dubious exercise. That the government just grabs it and then essentially also wastes it on all sorts of things. and so there should always be this question of that this income tax is something government should take seriously, given that it's grabbing somebody's fundamental product, and therefore it should spend it wisely and not piss it away. So that should be the guiding principle of all governments. Anyway, um, the Judy says about the 40% of Chinese exports are American companies. That's the whole point. Those American companies have to come home. Yeah, that's exactly the what Trump is trying to do. Have to come home and provide jobs to Americans. Yeah, that's right. Build up the American machine tool infrastructure and pay taxes to the U.S., not China. That's Trump's big package. It's not just about collecting money from tariffs in the short term. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. That's exactly the plan, which is provide jobs, and I mean, yeah, obviously you collect some money from the tariffs, um, but that's not the primary goal. The primary goal is to provide an incentive to come and invest in America, and that's why I said, hey, if you don't want to pay tariffs, build your factories in America. Then you don't have the tariff. And then um, and then, anyway, Anne Marie, thank you so much for your generosity. I really appreciate it. We in the music club, I posted a kind of a sacred music written for the organ by a 20th century composer, Marcel Dupré, not terribly well known. And I thought it was an interesting piece of music. And Anne Marie, who's is a professional musician and has a much greater understanding of music certainly than I do, I think wasn't particularly impressed by the music. To be honest, I see her point. I think it was an interesting piece of music to post, but I think that it had, I don't think it was a great piece of music, but nonetheless, it's interesting that in the 20th century, there was essentially religious music composed for the organ. I mean, we were familiar with the organ, particularly listened to so many of Bach's music on the organ. So it was interesting to listen to a 20th century music written specially for the organ. But I think Anne Marie's criticisms are well taken, and I'm quite sympathetic to them. But it's on the locals page. Go to the Gaggle Music Club, listen to this Marcel Dupré's music, and above all, read Anne Marie's comments, which are really interesting and as always very, very insightful. So thank you so much, Anne Marie. And then Marty, always very good to see you. Happy Tuesday. Always good to see you. Thank you, Marty. And then Robert, was always good to see you. Thank you, Robert, also for your generosity. And Robert says, so in other words, Trump is saying, hey, my deal with Miriam Adelson had only to do with the Palestinians, nothing in it grant a special dispensation to Israel on anything else. I think that's right. I think that's my take. I think that Israel gets a blank check on one issue only, which is the Palestinians. Basically, you can do what you like with the Palestinians. I think that's. I mean, there really is almost no restraint on Israel when it comes to that. When nuclear weapons, there was a little bit of restraint. I mean, the restraint that America insisted on when it came to Israel and the nuclear weapons is that Israel never admit that it has nuclear weapons. So everyone in the world knows that Israel has nuclear weapons, but Israel is not to admit that it has them. So it's a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy. So it wasn't, America didn't wholly sign off on Israel becoming a nuclear power. There was a restriction that America insisted on, that you don't ever admit it. But on other things, when it comes to the American economy, I think that Trump made that clear. It was us. Hey, you're going to lift these tariffs. I said, nope, not going to happen. And even raising that issue infuriated him so much that he suddenly brought up this the $4 billion that America hands over to Israel. He could have been harsher and said it's a hell of a lot more than 4 billion. Said brought that up, absolutely said 4 billion, and then snidely, sarcastically said, "My congratulations. Hey, you're a real master salesman. You know, you're wangling $4 billion out of us every year in exchange for nothing." I mean, Trump doesn't even pretend that America gets anything out of it. I mean, others, sort of the Israel lobby, somehow pretends that America's getting something out of it. Trump pretty much says, "I don't think you're getting anything out. We're getting anything out of it." Like Nixon said this as well once in an interview. "I don't think we're getting anything out of this special relationship with Israel." But Trump said this in response to this issue. Hey, are you going to lift these tariffs? And this just got him angry. Well, what? Lift anger after all that we do for you? Um, so I think that was yeah. Palestinians, you can do what you like. Do what you like in Lebanon as well. No problem at all. Syria, yeah, do whatever you want. But Turkey, and suddenly the Americans said, no, you have to listen to us when it comes to Turkey. You don't have a blank check on that. So it's like Palestinians or the Arabs, yeah, you can do what you like. And I think that's just interesting. Just that suddenly Israel ran against its limits. And if you go down this path, then I think you're going to get Trump is going to get pissed. He's not going to get pissed about you kill some aid workers. Trump couldn't care less. Bomb Beirut, don't care. But if you start pressing him on lifting tariffs, then he's going to get pissed. So, so that's was made clear to Netanyahu. Your entree here has limits. Marx, thank you very much. This is for your ankle guards. I appreciate it. Thank you. And then Vic Shakopoulos says, "What would be your three post-war European leaders, both socialist and capitalist bloc?" I'd say De Gaulle, Tito. Honestly, I can't think of anyone I would like to admire at the same time, consider a good politician or leader. That's an interesting one. I'm saying De Gaulle obviously is a good is a good choice. I'd say Willy Brandt. I think Willy Brandt was a good leader. I think he moved Germany away from that kind of intense Russophobic or intense anti-communist dogma that prevailed from about 1945 through to 1970. Just this, absolute loathing for the Soviet Union, and absolute refusal to accept the division of Germany and so on. That whole position that argued by Adenauer. And I think that Willy Brandt moved away from that. It was a major change in policy that he engineered, and his successors followed it. Tito, yeah, that's probably a good choice. I wonder who else one would think of. There was any. I can't think of any major leaders. I think. I think Kadar was quite a good leader, but he's not quite on the same level as the others, like Brandt, De Gaulle, Tito. Kadar was a quite effective leader of Hungary. I think he served Hungary rather well, given the circumstances in which he was actually hoisted into power, a deeply hated figure in 1956, but gradually became accepted by the Hungarian people, and the Hungarians kind of reconciled themselves to Kada. So he was quite an effective leader. Um, Other than that, it's honestly, yeah. I'd say those are my three. I'd say I think those are good choices. I think De Gaulle, Tito, Brandt, um, and Kada. So anyway, um, anyway, Anne Marie um, says, asking as a complete amateur in money issues, Jeffrey Sachs seems absolutely convinced that Trump is doing a silly thing with these tariffs, finally bringing down the living standards of the American people, reckoning and explaining it all in detail. What do you think about his theories in that matter? I think that's just wrong, and I find it strange why he would be taking, I think, such a wrong position. It's like he's happy constantly to be criticizing America, and that's fine. I mean, I criticize America, and I think that there's plenty to criticize. But why would one oppose America trying to improve its economic well-being? Why should one oppose America trying to do something about its hollowing out of its manufacturing base? So it's like people like Jeffrey Sachs, they're very happy to constantly criticize America, talk about these, the economic failures, and all this, um, the the economic decline, and in growing income inequality, and growing debt, and everything else. And then when somebody tries to do something about it, he suddenly gets very angry. So then you have to wonder, well, how sincere were you in all these critiques? Because they're all tied up. I mean, America has been basically shipping its manufacturing jobs overseas. Um, America has been continually running up debts. America has been running a trade deficit. The trade deficit has led to the financialization of the economy, because countries with trade surpluses were transferring their capital to Wall Street, and therefore people who were involved in finance were getting extremely wealthy. It was leading to ever growing income inequality. The inflationary policies that were pursued by Biden, by printing money, which was again unsustainable. The only way they could control inflation is by continually bringing in cheap labor, and therefore driving wages down. This was done deliberately. How do we control inflation? Well, we bring in cheap labor. So all of these things, income inequality, deindustrialization, a growing unsustainable debt, the kind of things that Sachs should be concerned about and purported to be concerned about, he's suddenly full of rage about an American president who thinks he's going to address this issue. So you then have to wonder, well, how sincere was Sachs about anything? Or was it just simply, hey, this is a cool thing for me to do? I'm a Columbia professor, and and my shtick is always to criticize America, and people like and I go for that as well. I like criticizing America, but one should also see there are positive things, and I think that trying to address these economic issues, I think, is a positive thing, and one should get away from, I think, just reflex criticism of anything America does. So I'm very disappointed in what Jeffrey Sachs has said. And whereas what Judy pointed to this, the Russian, who I think seems to grasp the issue very well in the way Sachs doesn't. Hey, you've got a big problem here. You ever growing debt, ever growing trade deficit, ever growing income inequality, ever growing deindustrialization. You need to do something about it. It's unsustainable if you want to maintain yourself as a great power. So, but Sachs doesn't seem to want anything good ever to happen in America. And I think maybe that's his thing. He becomes very popular as a professor in Columbia, because ultimately the kind of people who go to Columbia, they're perfectly happy, just trash America. That's fine. And I think that's become his that's his thing, and now he's built up this reputation on the internet and so on. So, um, I'm just disappointed in at the very least he should keep an open mind. I mean, that's to say, okay, fine, we don't know whether this is going to work out, but I think you should maintain an open mind, and I think that just disappointed that this distinguished professor from Columbia is unable to maintain an open mind. All right. Richard Phillips says there's quite a few China shows there. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think there's an awful lot of that. There are people who always then unleash this rage against me on YouTube. How dare you? They praise anything else, but the moment I say anything negative about China, suddenly get this all the attacks. Anyway, Vic Shakapopoulos says Ruby killing Oswald means silencing the most important witness by a guy with connections to the mob. Well, yes, but when you say connections to the mob, I mean he wasn't really anyone very important in the mob. I mean, it's like, but again, I mean, do you have any evidence that somebody told Ruby to do this? I mean, did somebody, Sam Giancana or one of them, did they say you got to, hit Oswald? So, I mean, if you're going to say, oh well, that's because the mob wanted to silence the assassin, then who was it who wanted to do it? So, I mean, who was the mob leader? See, this is the problem with when we talk about the assassination is that just the culprits are always some nebulous entity, and then you ask, okay, well, who was it? Who was a specific person who did this? Just saying, oh, it is the mob or the CIA, and that's, it's like, well, I mean, nobody likes the mob, nobody likes the CIA, so yeah, they did it. But anyway, and to the mob, the CIA, and Mossad, it's not a proof of a conspiracy in a lawyerly way, but how can it not be read as a strong indication of it? Again, check all the ridiculous details around Oswald in that Parenti lecture. Parenti did some good work. I mean, and but he also did some crappy work, and frankly, I didn't. Don't really buy it. The Oswald story has been pretty well documented. And the rest of the CIA connections or whatever. I mean, those have never really been presented. Now, this is the problem: is that we can always ask all these questions. I mean, it's throughout there's any number of questions, but you have to go kind of beyond that and come up with a plausible hypothesis. I mean, this is like in any scientific theory. When you want to reject the scientific theory, okay, can you present a better theory to explain the facts? But not just some vague thing. Oh, it was the Mossad, and then you say, okay, great. Do you have any evidence for that? Oh, okay. But anyway, thank you so much, Vic. And then Robert says, Murray Rothbard argued that tariffs halve consumers by raising prices and limiting choices. He believed they distort free markets, protect inefficient industries, and create economic inefficiencies. For Rothbard, tariffs are a form of government intervention that benefits a few at the expense of the many, violating principles of individual liberty and free trade. Yeah, though he was a libertarian, and that is the libertarian argument. But of course, he was always, I mean, he wants, the pure free markets. I mean, that's his thing. And I just don't really buy that, and I'm not sure. But it's it's if you you can always subscribe to that, the doctrine of free markets, and the only reason that free markets don't work is that nobody actually pursues the free markets, and that's ultimately the issue. I mean, if you have a perfectly free market, probably everything does indeed work out in that the goods are distributed to where they're needed, and there are no there's perfect elasticity. There are no hiccups, no restrictions in there. But that's never what happens, and so there's never the proper allocation of goods because there are no free markets. And I think that's really been particularly in the case of trade. So it's like there is no free trade. I mean, countries cheat like mad um, to on behalf of their own manufacturers, on behalf of their own people. So there is no free trade. Even if you remove tariffs, there's still all sorts of restrictions in place to ensure that other countries' goods don't get in. Since there is no, so that's always been the problem of the free marketeers. And you say, well, how come the free market didn't work? They said, well, that wasn't really free. Yeah, that's the point. It wasn't really free, and so the free market didn't work. So, why if free trade is so wonderful, how come it hasn't really worked? How come some people have really lost out on this and others have benefited enormously? Well, because they never really pursued free trade. So so the libertarians like Rothbard, like Ludwig van Mises, and all of those Austrian economists, there's always been the problem that nobody nobody has ever come up with a free market. It's just purely a theoretical construct. Um, and that's uh, yeah. That's why it's always this you know great model, but it never succeeds. I was going to say something, and then it's just my thought has escaped me. Um, and I mean, yeah. So this is the Reagan argument. That's the why free markets. It's but you still have to. This is the when Milton Friedman would always say, "Oh, yeah, but the free markets and so on." But there are no free markets. There's always everybody's always constraints. Governments interfere in the economies in all sorts of ways in every country. So essentially, there is no free trade. And so anyway, Robert says Sachs argues that a good like cars makes use of parts produced all over the world, which in the case of the U.S. are shipped into the U.S. for final assembly. In this way, the grittier production jobs are in the less developed world, while the more desirable assembled in the U.S. Sachs argues tariffs will end the division of labor. Do Americans really want to do the dirty work jobs and give up the more posh jobs? I think the issue is that in order to be a serious economic power, you need to be doing the assembly from start to finish, which is what America did, which is what China does. I mean, what is hilarious about Sachs and the rest of them is that China does exactly this thing that the Wall Street Journal and Jeffrey Sachs criticize. Oh, we don't want to be doing all these menial jobs. Oh, we don't want to get these dirty, where we get our hands dirty. We'll let somebody else do it. We'll do the high end jobs. Well, China doesn't do it. But when China doesn't do it, and in fact, it wants to maintain the lines of production in China, that's great. They praise China for that. Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, look at that. They go to conferences and say, oh, look at what China is doing. And this is fantastic. This is why China is becoming the rising economic power. So it's good when China maintains the lines of production inside China, But America apparently can't. America has to, import spare parts from here and spare parts from there, and constantly import and export and re-import and re-export the same cars in order to assemble the car, even though once, when America was a major power, America could assemble a car from start to finish made up of American parts. And this is what China does. And then suddenly you say, oh, well, we can't possibly do that. Why can't we do that? Why can't America do just that? Because that's the heart of you being a major economic power, that you're able to assemble cars, and that means trucks, and that means tanks, and that means all sorts of things. Anything that moves, railway tracks, and rolling stock, all of these things you're able to assemble from start to finish in your country, and you're not dependent on parts coming in from elsewhere. And this is what China has done. And so when China, I'll say it again, when China does it, then that's great. That's fantastic. And that people praise China and they laud China to the skies like Jeffrey Sachs does. So if it's great when China does it, why can't America do it? So anyway, I'm sorry, but I'm not buying the theory that we're going to have this division of labor. No, you want to have everything at your fingertips, because if you're going to be involved in a war, then you want to be able to produce everything at home and not be reliant upon imports. I mean, we saw during COVID. Hey, I thought America was this leading pharmaceutical nation. Turns out we're dependent on key products, importing products from abroad. Well, that's not good. China doesn't know. China produces its pharmaceuticals from start to finish in China. And that's great. Why can't America produce pharmaceuticals from start to finish in the United States? Anyway, The Little Girl of Hanoi. That was Vic presented that as an alternative, a Vietnamese movie about the war. All right, let me write this down. And that was 1975. So that's something. Okay, The Little Girl. I haven't seen this. I've never even heard of it. The Little Girl of Hanoi. 1975. Okay, that's a good idea. NKMRD. Hearing about tobacco tax always puts me in a bad mood. It's ruthless. Yes, understandable. And then Marty says, "Buddy tax on all tips." Yeah, that's right. He takes everything. Takes the tax and the tips. Whatever goes, he takes. When I ask, well, what about me? Well, what about you? He puts an Apple says that. Well, what about you? Yeah. NK Mahdi said, yeah, I might be better off with my high-priced tobacco than George with that doggo tax, pressure, and mafia talk. Buddy and gang clearly show their muscle. Yeah, no, I think that's right. So that's right. Anyway, so thank you. I think my time is up. I think I've been doing this. I was going to do a short one today, but it never happens. But anyway, thank you everybody who joined me. Thank you for all your really interesting thoughts and questions. And I just noticed Opry says Jeffrey Sachs is correct to criticize Trump's across-the-board tariffs, but he offers no alternatives to fix America's trade problem. No, I think that's reasonable. He offers no alternatives. And I think that's true about a lot of the people who are complaining and whining and moaning about what Trump is doing. Is that, well, what's your plan? Other than, well, I'm going to go on whining, moaning, and complaining about everything that America does. Yeah, let's go on talking about income inequalities and the growing debt and all the rest, and why we don't have universal health care and blah, 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 blah. Okay, we can go on. We can go on doing this. We can go on sounding like Bernie Sanders. Whoa, boom. Refresh this page. Okay, well. Well, that was I lost a lot of that. That was, but it looks like it was gone. Anyway, I'm now gone. There was something that I wanted to answer, but now everything is gone blank. So thank you very much, everybody who joined me, and we will be back on Thursday at the same time. Until then, all the best. Good night. See you Thursday. Bye bye.